I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also, for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but these are just my first impressions based on watching the press.
The easiest conclusions to accept are often the ones delivered with absolute confidence. But what if that confidence, or why do so many people stop questioning the moment an official? And what happens when the one piece of evidence capable of answering everything remains hidden from nearly everyone outside a secure office? Those questions now sit at the heart of the Nolan Wells investigation. They have drawn renewed attention from investigators, journalists, and most recently, a forensic physician who believes this case deserves another, much closer look. After reviewing the available medical information, the expert raised the possibility that Nolan may have died from manual strangulation. That observation alone has reignited a case many believed had already reached its conclusion. So what convinced an experienced forensic specialist to challenge the narrative that had been publicly accepted? What evidence was available for review? And perhaps even more importantly, what evidence remained out of reach? Those questions are far from theoretical. They strike directly at the foundation of the explanation the public was initially asked to believe. Over the next several minutes, we'll examine the medical evidence, the forensic analysis, and the overlooked details that have received far less attention than the headlines surrounding this case. By the end, you'll understand why this medical opinion has become one of the most controversial developments in the Nolan Wells investigation, and why the answer investigators are searching for may still exist within evidence that few people have ever been allowed to examine. If you appreciate case coverage that prioritizes documents over rumors and evidence over speculation, consider subscribing and enabling notifications. New records continue to emerge in this investigation, often a little at a time. In cases like this, being first doesn't always mean being right. We'd rather wait for the facts than rush to conclusions, and if you stay with us, you'll see each new development as it unfolds. But before any of that makes sense, we need to return to where this investigation began. Because to understand why so many questions are being asked today, it's important to understand how a death investigation is supposed to unfold in the first place. Determining a cause of death is not something investigators simply decide at the scene. It is a medical conclusion reached only after evidence is collected, examined, and competing explanations have been carefully ruled. At some point, the death of investigators inside the president's cabinet was transferred to a raw press conference. The upcoming medical conclusion was called to the presidents to be classified and no actual explanations for evidence. In Nolan Wells' case, critics argue that this sequence may have been reversed. Just days after Nolan disappeared, the sheriff leading the investigation in Jackson County stood before reporters and publicly stated that authorities did not believe foul play was involved. At that moment, however, one critical step had not yet occurred. No formal autopsy had been completed. No forensic pathologist had examined Nolan's body. No complete medical analysis had been performed. By every investigative standard, the case was still in its earliest stages. Yet the public had already been given what sounded like a final answer, as though the investigation had little left to uncover. What many people don't realize is that deaths involving recovered bodies of water are among the most complicated situations a forensic pathologist can face. In forensic medicine, drowning is considered a diagnosis of exclusion. Investigators don't confirm it simply because a body is found in a lake, river, or bay. Instead, they must first eliminate every other reasonable explanation for death. That's because water can hide critical evidence. A victim may have drowned naturally, or they may have died before ever entering the water. By the time a body is recovered, those two scenarios can appear remarkably similar on the surface. Determining which one occurred requires a careful process, not assumptions. According to standard forensic practice, examiners must systematically rule out possibilities such as blunt force injuries, trauma to the neck, drug or alcohol toxicity, internal medical conditions, and other fatal injuries before concluding that drowning was the actual cause of death. Only after those alternatives have been thoroughly evaluated can drowning be listed as the official cause. It's not simply recommended, it's a fundamental part of the investigative process. Critics argue that the sheriff's early public remarks appear to bypass that sequence altogether. Instead of waiting for the medical evidence to guide the conclusion seemed to arrive before the medical examination had even begun. The timeline makes that concern even more significant. Nolan, still a teenager, had been missing for several days before his body was recovered from the water on July 6th. Every hour that passes after death affects what forensic specialists are able to observe. Human remains continue to decompose. Water alters tissue. Biological evidence gradually disappears. Each passing day narrows the window in which investigators can recover reliable forensic information. By the time Nolan was found, that clock had already been running for days. That reality is one reason forensic experts often emphasize caution in the earliest public statements. As evidence deteriorates, every remaining detail becomes more valuable, not less. To be fair, it's entirely possible the sheriff witnessed circumstances at the recovery scene that influenced his assessment. But observations made at the scene are not the same as medical findings. They haven't undergone laboratory examination, forensic documentation, or independent review. And while such observations may help direct an investigation, they cannot replace the conclusions reached through a formal autopsy. Even so, public statements carry enormous influence. Once authorities describe a death as an accident, or suggest that foul play is unlikely, that framework often shapes everything that follows. It can influence public perception, media coverage, investigative priorities, and even expectations surrounding future evidence. Ideally, the process works in the opposite direction. First comes the examination, then comes the conclusion. In Nolan Wells' case, many believe those steps unfolded in reverse, and once an early narrative takes hold, changing it can become extraordinarily difficult. Nolan's family did not simply accept that explanation. Rather than focusing on public confrontation, they sought an independent review of the evidence. They retained civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump and arranged for a separate forensic pathologist to conduct an independent examination, hoping to compare the state's conclusions against the physical findings themselves. That independent autopsy took place on July 10th, only a few days after Nolan's body had been recovered. But even an independent examination cannot erase the effects of time. In forensic science, a second autopsy is not a fresh beginning. It starts with evidence that has already changed. Every hour after death alters the body. Every day reduces what investigators can still recover. The body itself serves as a physical record, but unlike written records, its details gradually disappear. By the time the independent pathologist began the examination, Nolan's body had already remained in the water for several days, had been recovered from the scene, and had undergone the state's original autopsy. Each of those stages inevitably affected the evidence that remained. Refrigeration can slow the natural process of decomposition, but it cannot reverse it. Refrigeration can slow decomposition, but it cannot stop it. And once a body has remained submerged, the challenges multiply. Water softens tissue, alters delicate structures, and can obscure the subtle details forensic specialists rely on to reconstruct what happened. By the time the independent pathologist began his work, he was examining evidence that had already been altered by both time and the environment. In many ways, it was like trying to read a document after portions of the ink had already faded. When that examination was complete, the conclusion surprised many observers. The independent finding did not classify Nolan's death as an accident. It also did not identify it as a homicide. Instead, the manner of death was listed as undetermined. That single word is frequently misunderstood, so it's important to be clear about what it actually means. An undetermined ruling does not suggest that nothing occurred, nor does it validate or dismiss anyone's suspicions. It simply reflects that the available medical evidence was not sufficient to confidently support one explanation while excluding every other reasonable possibility. One conclusion had been delivered quickly and with certainty. The other acknowledged the limits of what the evidence could actually prove. That distinction isn't simply a disagreement between experts. It's an example of one forensic professional choosing not to make a claim that the available evidence could not fully support. So, what prevented the independent examiner from reaching a more definitive answer? He possessed the necessary expertise. He had the family's authorization, he had access to Nolan's remains, but according to reports surrounding the examination, one critical piece of evidence was missing. Not because it had decomposed, not because the water had destroyed it, because it was never made available. The missing portion involved the front of the neck, specifically the collection of internal tissues and structures that forensic pathologists commonly refer to as the neck block. According to the family's representatives, that section had been retained by the state medical examiner's office rather than released with the rest of the body. As a result, when the independent autopsy took place, one of the most significant anatomical regions for evaluating certain causes of death could not be examined. That detail carries enormous forensic significance. Different causes of death leave different patterns of evidence throughout the body. When investigators are evaluating the possibility of manual strangulation, some of the most important findings are typically located in the front of the neck. The back of the neck is composed primarily of muscle and the cervical spine. The front, however, contains the airway, major blood vessels, and several delicate structures that may preserve signs of compression if force is applied. Forensic pathologists generally pay close attention to three key areas. The first is the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone positioned high in the throat. Unlike most bones in the human body, it has relatively little protection. In some cases of manual strangulation, forensic experts have documented fractures to this bone consistent with significant external pressure. The second area involves the stract muscles, the thin muscles running along the front of the neck. Compression can sometimes rupture tiny blood vessels within these muscles, leaving internal hemorrhages that may be invisible externally, but recognizable during a detailed examination. The third involves petechia, tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that can develop when sustained pressure interferes with normal blood flow. These small hemorrhages may appear in the eyes, facial tissues, or even the lining surrounding the heart, depending on the circumstances. Individually, none of these findings automatically establishes a cause of death, but together they can form a pattern. And in forensic pathology, recognizing patterns rather than relying on any single observation is often what leads investigators toward the most reliable conclusions. The question, however, is impossible to ignore. If one of the most important anatomical regions was unavailable for independent review, how much of the overall picture could truly be evaluated? Each of those three forensic indicators is found within the very section of the body that was retained rather than released. That brings us to the medical expert's recent assessment. After reviewing the material that was available, the pathologist pointed to what he viewed as a critical limitation. Without access to the internal structures at the front of the neck, he explained, it is impossible to confirm manual strangulation. But just as importantly, it is also impossible to confidently exclude it. That is the central dilemma in this investigation. The available evidence does not establish that strangulation occurred. At the same time, the portion of the evidence most capable of answering that question was not available for independent examination. Those are two very different things. To be fair, the decision to retain tissue during a death investigation is not, by itself, unusual. Medical examiners routinely preserve organs or tissue samples for additional testing, documentation, or evidentiary purposes. Standing alone, that practice does not indicate wrongdoing. The issue, critics argue, is not the retention itself. It's what remains unknown. If the state medical examiner retained the neck structures, and those structures were presumably examined during the original autopsy, whatever observations resulted from that examination would ordinarily be reflected in the state's complete autopsy findings. Yet the full report has not been publicly released. So, the question isn't simply why the tissue was retained. It's what the examination of that tissue ultimately revealed, and why the public has yet to see those findings. Another piece of this case involves toxicology, and while it may appear straightforward, forensic science tells a much more complicated story. Numbers on a laboratory report often seem definitive. But in cases involving advanced decomposition, one particular measurement requires careful interpretation: blood alcohol concentration. When a body is examined shortly after death, a blood alcohol result often provides a reliable indication of alcohol present at the time of death. This case, however, did not involve a freshly recovered body. That distinction matters. As decomposition progresses, naturally occurring bacteria begin breaking down tissue. During that process, certain bacteria can produce alcohol after death, even if the individual consumed little or none before dying. Under the right conditions, that postmortem alcohol production can become significant enough to affect laboratory measurements. Because Nolan's body remained in the water for several days before recovery, forensic experts would typically evaluate any alcohol findings alongside the degree of decomposition rather than interpreting the laboratory number in isolation. A thorough toxicological review considers additional chemical markers, the condition of the remains, and other forensic indicators before determining whether an alcohol reading accurately reflects what was present before death. Without that broader context, a single laboratory value cannot tell the entire story. Understanding the science behind these findings is often just as important as understanding the findings themselves. Beyond the forensic evidence, there has also been a noticeable shift in the public messaging surrounding this investigation. At one point, a reporter sought answers directly from officials instead of relying solely on prepared public statements. The response sounded markedly different from the certainty expressed in the earliest days of the case. Rather than repeating that foul play had been ruled out, officials described the matter in far more cautious terms. They said the investigation remained active. That change in language did not go unnoticed. After all, there is an obvious tension between declaring a case effectively resolved while also acknowledging that investigators are still working to determine exactly what happened. If an investigation is ongoing, and by definition, not every question has been answered, and that raises an unavoidable question: was the case ever as settled as the public was initially led to believe? When officials were later asked to explain those inconsistencies, clear answers were difficult to find. Instead of providing specific details, responsibility was often redirected to other agencies or departments, leaving many of the original questions unresolved. That response became another turning point in the public conversation. The concerns that followed were not by themselves accusations of misconduct. They were questions about transparency and accountability. In smaller jurisdictions, it's common for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, medical examiners, and other public officials to know one another professionally, or even personally. By itself, that fact proves nothing improper. But it does raise an understandable question. How can the public be confident that every aspect of an investigation has been evaluated with complete independence when many of the people involved work within the same close professional network? That is one of the reasons independent review exists. It's also a major reason Nolan's family sought a second forensic opinion rather than relying exclusively on the state's findings. As things stand today, the case presents two separate challenges. One involves science, the other involves process. On the scientific side, there is a toxicology result that forensic experts say cannot be interpreted responsibly without considering the effects of decomposition. On the procedural side, there are public statements that became noticeably more cautious as additional questions were asked. Alongside that is a family continuing to request transparency rather than conclusions, and a growing number of observers asking whether the investigative process itself has been sufficiently open. Although those issues are different, they ultimately point back to the same unanswered question, the original autopsy report. It remains one of the most significant documents in the case, yet it has not been made available outside the state. There is an important distinction between a case that is unsolved and one that is unfinished. An unsolved case suggests the truth has been lost. An unfinished case suggests the necessary answers may still exist, they simply haven't been fully disclosed. At this stage, three developments could significantly clarify the investigation. The first is the release of the original autopsy report. That document would contain the state's recorded medical findings and could help explain both the condition of Nolan's body and the reasons certain anatomical evidence was retained during the examination. The second is independent access to the preserved neck tissue. According to available reporting, that evidence has not been destroyed. If it remains properly preserved, a qualified forensic pathologist could potentially examine those structures directly, providing an independent assessment of one of the most important areas in the case. The third is a complete toxicology interpretation that fully accounts for post-mortem decomposition instead of relying solely on raw laboratory values. None of these steps require speculation. They require documentation, they require access, and they require transparency. It is equally important to recognize what has not been established. No criminal act has been proven. No individual has been formally charged. The questions surrounding this case remain exactly that, questions awaiting evidence, not conclusions. The independent examination ultimately reached a single conclusion, undetermined. That finding has not changed, and nothing presented in this video should be interpreted as proving otherwise. What is not in dispute, however, is the sequence of events. A public conclusion was announced before the forensic examination had been completed. That decision became the starting point for every question that followed. Since then, the discussion has centered not only on what happened to Nolan Wells, but also on whether the investigative process unfolded in the order it was supposed to. Throughout all of this, Nolan's family has remained consistent in what they are asking for. They are not publicly demanding that someone be arrested. They are not asking for a conviction before the evidence exists. Their request is far more fundamental. They want the records. They want transparency. They want findings that can be independently examined, verified, and understood. That means releasing the original autopsy report. It means allowing qualified experts to review the retained neck tissue if it remains available. And it means ensuring the toxicology evidence is interpreted within its proper forensic context, taking decomposition into account rather than relying on isolated laboratory numbers. Wherever that evidence ultimately leads, whether it supports an accidental death or points investigators toward a different conclusion, the family deserves an answer grounded in science, documentation, and a process the public can trust. At this point, the story is still unfinished. The final chapter has yet to be written, but the path forward is remarkably clear. The evidence already exists. What remains is access to it. And when those records are eventually released, they will provide the strongest opportunity yet to separate verified findings from assumptions and unanswered questions. When that day comes, we'll examine every document carefully, explain the forensic details step by step, and focus on what the evidence actually shows, not what speculation suggests. If you want to follow this case as new records emerge, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Developments and investigations like this can happen without warning, and when the next set of documents becomes public, we'll be here to break them down carefully, accurately, and one piece of evidence at a time.